name's Jan Wood and you're watching Coffee Break, and my special guest is Dr Keith Suter. Now, we have a mutual love of Margaret Holmes.
Margaret Holmes was one of the first peace campaigners I met when I came to Australia in 1973. I was involved with peace campaigning in Great Britain, and I was told that I should look up Margaret Holmes when I came to do my PhD. I was only due to come out here temporarily, but I've stayed on since 1973. And so Margaret was already well known internationally, an interesting figure in the sense that she was the wife of a North Shore doctor in Sydney's elite North Shore, a person you would normally expect to be very conservative. Instead, she took up the issues of Aboriginal rights, of women's rights, of the environment, and of course the peace movement. And as we now know, ASIO had bugged her telephone. And it's quite interesting now that so many people are writing their memoirs, how useful the ASIO files are, because you can now make your own application for freedom of information. You get that ASIO file, and that'll give you some of the dates to help jog your memory as to where the subject of your book was at the time. And in the case of Margaret Holmes, they did a lot of bugging on her phone.
But you couldn't meet someone as gentle or as dainty or just...
But that was why she was obviously seen as a threat to Australia's national security. Because obviously if you're dealing with a long-haired ratbag, you knew where they stood. Here you were dealing with the wife of a very successful medical practitioner from an elite part of Sydney, and you would not expect that sort of person to hold those sorts of views. And of course she was very influential precisely because, as you say, she was a very gentle, well-spoken, well-educated person who was very articulate.
Okay. Because her mother was quite an activist. Margaret told me her mother would go around and look for deprived children. And one day her mother found a little mentally retarded boy who was living in a chook shed. The family didn't want to know who was... And so Margaret's mother activated and got the little boy put in a proper environment, and he took off like... WILPF is a global organisation.
That's right. It's the oldest women's peace organisation. One of the reasons why I enjoy my association with it is it has managed to survive since 1915. Many other groups come and go, they waver, they go up and down, but the WILPF, those very dedicated women are staying in the business for the long haul. In a sense, they are an inspiration because they show the amount of dedication you've got to put in. You don't just jump around from one issue to the next, whatever's fashionable. You have certain basic ideas and you campaign on those ideas from one decade to the next. It's interesting to look back at the biography of Margaret Holmes and to look at the issues that she was campaigning on and how unpopular, how controversial they were at the time. Now you talk to a generation of young people and they say, well, haven't we always had Aboriginal rights? Yeah. Haven't we always had equal opportunity for women and all this sort of thing? I know we've still got a way to go. But here was Margaret in her pioneering role taking on a really daring role, which now, decades later, everybody says, well, we take that for granted.
Yeah, we do. Now, in the early 2000s, I went to Margaret's house. She was elderly, she was in her 90s, and I would stay for an hour because after that she'd get too tired. But she told me her story on my video camera. And one thing that's stuck in my head is her photo album.
And I'm a member of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, shortly known as WILPF, of which I've been a member since 1959. My father was a radiologist, he was a doctor, and he was doing very early X-ray work. He was passionately fond of photography, and I think that drew him into X-ray work. And he was a radiologist at Sydney Hospital. And when Mum and Dad first married, they were married in 1906. They lived just opposite Sydney Hospital. They had a little house just opposite theirs. Of course, it no longer exists. And they lived there for some years. trying to have a child and not having a child from 1906 until somebody said there's some belief that this X-ray thing is causing sterility in men. So, acting on this suggestion, my father gave up radiology and went to live at Warunga. They went to live at Warunga, and he set up as a GP, and blow me down, within a year or so, I was born. So there may have been something in this, you see. They had no screening, they had no knowledge about X-rays, really. So I might never have existed. And that would have been terrible. But both my parents were extremely public spirited. My father was in all sorts of things. He was on the Ku-ring-gai Municipal Council. He was the chairman of Abbottsley School for a good few years. He ran the Warunga Progress Association, and he was, they were both very, very, public-spirited, I suppose you'd say. So I was brought up in that kind of atmosphere of feeling that, yes, what was this? A little quote my mother had, something like this: service is the rent you pay for your room on earth. If you have a beautiful room, like we had a lovely home at Warunga, a beautiful garden, lovely house, everything we wanted. So we owed a good bit of rent. We owed a good bit of service in the form of rent, you see. So I suppose I still ought to be paying a good deal of rent now, oughtn't I? But, you sort of absorb this, I think. My father was a doctor, as I said, and he had been in the some kind of volunteer military thing as a doctor. I don't know I've forgotten what it was called, but they had some volunteer sort of thing. So when the war came, he was one of the people who offered to go overseas with soldiers, with a hospital, whatever hospital it was. Here, the Australian Army Medical Corps officers and mess and nurses, these were the sort of people that he knew already. This was down at Kenmore, at Goulburn, where there was a hospital, still is, I think. They were a mental hospital, I think. And this is a funny photo. My father was quite short, and this Dr Clarence Reid, R-E-I-D, he was a very tall man. Mum looks very sad there, doesn't she?
Which is your mum?
That one. But the hats, just look at the hats they wore. And look at the costumes on the nursing sisters. They look like Florence Nightingale time almost, don't they? This was the ship that my father went to Egypt on, the Kyara, that left Sydney on the 25th of November 1914, ostensibly to go to France, and then stopped in Egypt, as I told you. Now, I don't know whether this is some hospital ships. Here's an ambulance being loaded. And here are the troop. Of course, this was all a hospital ship, so these men would all have been. They weren't fighting men. They were hospital orderlies and all that kind of thing. They probably had a lot of nurses too. I don't see any females, but probably did. Well, they were supposed to be going to England or to France rather, because the Western Front was on. This was in the beginning of 1915, and Australian soldiers were being sent to France, and this unit was to go and be the hospital for any wounded. So Dad sets off in December 1914 or early January. She decided she should go to England too, and take us and set up a house in England, in London, to which my father could come on leave from France and have a nice little family life. So, Mum and us 3 children, plus our nurse girl, a young country Australian girl, Amy, plus my mother's sister, Beatrice, our auntie Trix. We all set off by ship, just after Dad had left on the troop ship, on the hospital ship. We set off for England via the Cape. Now Dad's ship was to go via the Suez Canal, right? And when Mum got to Cape Town, she had a cable from Dad in Egypt at the other end of Africa, saying that their unit was to be stopped in Egypt, but it wasn't to go on to England at all. Because Gallipoli was about to happen, you see, in April 1915, and his hospital was to set up there in Cairo, or just out of Cairo, and set up to receive the expected wounded and ill from Gallipoli. So what was poor Mum to do? There she was at the other end of Africa. There was nothing for her to do but to go on to England. So we all went on to England, and I can remember even in the Channel there, we had to spend all night in our clothes because of the submarine in the Channel, in the English Channel. I can remember going to bed and having my little button-up boots on because you had to be fully clothed. And various men on the ship had told Mum that they would be responsible, each one for one of the children, you see, so she could be sure we'd all be safe, etc. We had lifeboat drill every day and all that kind of thing. Well, I just have vague memories of that. But then Mum got this flat in London, and she then decided that she would go over to Egypt and join Dad in Egypt. Mind you, there's a world war happening in France, in the north of France. Her idea was to catch a train somewhere at Bordeaux or somewhere and take us all the way across France and down through Italy and catch a boat and go over to Egypt. But she was dissuaded from that because people told her that the Germans were coming in so fast that possibly she'd be on a troop train and we'd all be heaved out and the troops would go in and so on. So she decided we'd go by boat. Well, Dad, by this time, had made friends with an English civilian doctor in Egypt, a Dr Madden. Now, he was a man who had a family, a wife and children, who were at home in England for the schooling of the children. But he had the flat in Cairo, in the middle of Cairo, which was really their Egyptian home, you see. And only he was occupying it with several Egyptian servants, of course. And so my father got him to let Mum and us 3 kids, and Aunt Trixie stayed behind in England, she didn't come, but Mum and us 3 kids and Amy were to be tenants in the flat, and Mum would housekeep for Dr Madden. Well, this is when we were in Cairo, in Egypt, during the First World War. This would have been about after Gallipoli. Gallipoli was in April 1915, so this would have been later than that, probably June or May or June, I don't know the date. But my mother, of course, was with us, and we had quite a lot of social life, really, because, of course, there weren't that many Australian. My mother would be invited out to all sorts of things and take the children with her. And this one, that photo shows us in some park or garden or other with a Colonel Martin, whom I must say I can't really remember, but he and I have changed hats, you see. He's wearing my hat and I'm wearing his solar topee, which was what the men used to wear. You see, here's another one, Captain Fletcher. He's got a solar topee, and that was what their regulation headgear was. And my mother, of course, has this dark veil which she would put down in the bright sun because she had very pale blue eyes. She was a very fair woman, and she felt the glare terribly. So anywhere you see her, you'll always see her with a veil that she would put down, not from any Islamic principle, but just to shield her from the sun. To me, that one, I don't know what I'm holding. That's my sister Tingsy. Now, I was 6 then, she was 3, and that's our little brother Peter, who was then about 18 months old. Amy Heinsohn, and there she is rocking, swinging my little baby brother. And that's my mother with 3 children. My mother's brother, now this was very interesting. He was a private in my father's unit. My father was he was a lieutenant, I think he was only still a major then. Now my father wanted to take my brother, my uncle, his brother-in-law, to dinner. He said, but he's my brother-in-law. I said, that doesn't matter. He is OR. You can come in, but he can't. So my father turned round and said, well, if I can't take my own brother-in-law, I'm certainly not coming in. And he walked out. But I mean, it was the British Raj, you know, this kind of terrible distinction between the officer class and the other ranks. So there we were for about, I don't know how many months, several months in Egypt in the 1915s, including the time when the men started to come back from Gallipoli, from the terrible campaign in Gallipoli. And actually, my mother used to go round the hospital wards and take comforts and things to the men. And I went round with her a few times, and I can remember quite well these men giving me cigarette cards. Cigarette cards were a great thing for kids then, you know. You know a cigarette card? That's where you collected cigarette cards, and any man that had been given a packet of cigarettes, he'd say, oh, here you are, darling, you've got a cigarette card. Ooh, yes. So I can just remember going round these wards there, and I can remember a few other things about Egypt, going and looking at the pyramids and that kind of thing. That's my father, that's his uncle, my great-uncle George.
It's a wonderful photo.
I suspect it might have been a photographer taking that. Dad didn't take it himself. I don't know the history of that story. Well, that was Uncle Fred, who finally got killed in France because the unit went on to France. Here's the little brother. In there we are with my mother, and here I am being swung around on what do you call these little things that kids still have?
Merry-go-round.
Yeah. Oh, and then these officers, they had this is interesting, I'm sure. Some of them had hired a dahabeah. He's got written here, our dahabeah at Gezira. Now that was this boat that some of the officers had hired. So when they had some time off, they could go down there and have a little sail on the Nile. Then Dad got the job of coming back with a hospital ship full of wounded and sick men. He was to be the chief medical officer on it. Mum tried to get us to go on that too. She did all she could to persuade the authorities that it wouldn't matter at all to have one wife and 3 little kids as well, and then a nurse girl, of course. Well, she was turned down very sensibly, I think.
This is
The hospital ship Themistocles, that must have been the one Dad came back to Australia on, that's right. This was the one that my mother wanted to get us to come on. I don't know how Lieutenant Colonel had his Mrs. Stokes with him, but perhaps she was just seeing him off. And here they are getting off at Fremantle. So we had to come back in another boat. And when we got to Perth, I remember Mum got interviewed by the press there. And she told them about how the soldiers, the wounded men and sick men in Egypt from Gallipoli were clad in thick flannel pyjamas, because that was what the Red Cross had got ready for France, you see. And this unit had been going to go to France, and they were going to have nice warm pyjamas for them there. But of course in Egypt it was awful. So she stirred up a bit of a hornet's nest over that, and had a bit of publicity in the Perth paper. And as a result of that, apparently, the Red Cross very quickly got to work sending them nice short-sleeved or, little short pyjama pants and that kind of thing, much more suitable. Anyhow, of course, then we came all the way back home, and I don't know what my father... Oh, yes, of course I do know what he did. He became the officer in charge of this Georges Heights Hospital up here, which was the biggest military hospital in Australia at that time. And that's where people were sent that had been on his ship.
Well, next year WILPF is turning 100, and they want to honour women who have worked in the peace movement or with WILPF in the 20th and the 21st century. So I thought to myself, if anybody out there in the audience who has, whose mother or grandmother or great-grandmother or sister who's been involved in WILPF, if they would like to contribute.
Because what we want is very much a people's history. We know that generals write their memoirs. We don't get so many memoirs written by peace activists. We celebrate battles. We don't celebrate the work of the peace activists. And so I think we should give equal opportunity for peace.
Okay. Well, I think that's a wonderful project, and it'll be between now and 2015.
Good.